Some houses don't forget, they just wait. The chair by the window hadn't moved in 11 years, not an inch, not a scrape across the hardwood, as if time itself had stepped carefully around it, refusing to disturb what it held. Gloria Reed sat across from it now, hands folded in her lap, her fingers resting against each other like they were remembering something her voice no longer said out loud. The late afternoon light stretching thin across the floorboards, catching dust that drifted slowly, almost respectfully, through the air, and she tilted her head just slightly, the way people do when they're listening, not to a sound, but to a presence that lingers in the quiet. "He won't come back," she said, her voice calm, certain, but not cold, as if she had rehearsed the sentence enough times that it no longer needed emotion to carry it, only truth, or what she had accepted as truth. Outside, a car engine ticked as it cooled, metal settling after a long drive, though she didn't turn toward the sound, not yet, because some arrivals take a moment before they become real, and some doors stay closed just a little longer, even when someone is standing on the other side. Marcus Reed stood at the end of the walkway, his hand still wrapped around the handle of a worn duffel bag, the fabric creased, faded, carrying the weight of years that never quite found a place to rest, and he didn't move forward right away, didn't step onto the porch, didn't reach for the door, because the house in front of him looked the same and completely different at once, like a memory that had been carefully preserved but no longer belonged to him. The paint hadn't changed, the mailbox still leaned slightly to the left, the wind chime near the eaves barely stirred in the soft breeze, but something underneath all of it felt occupied, like the space had decided to continue without him. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled, the kind of breath a man learns to take when he's spent years holding more than he ever says. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key, the metal dulled from time, from being carried but never used, and he turned it between his fingers once, just once, before stepping forward. Inside, Gloria's gaze shifted, not toward the door, but toward the hallway, as if she felt something change in the structure of the silence itself, like the house had recognized a name it hadn't heard in years. Marcus climbed the 3 wooden steps, each one answering with a quiet creak, not loud enough to announce him, but enough to remind him that the past doesn't stay buried. It just waits in places like this, in sounds like that. And when he reached the door, he didn't knock, didn't call out. He simply looked at the lock, noticing the small, almost invisible scratches around it, newer than the rest of the frame. And for the first time since he arrived, something in his expression shifted, not shock, not anger, just a quiet understanding that whatever he left behind 11 years ago had not been left untouched. The key did not fit the way it used to, not because it was the wrong one, but because the lock resisted it, like a memory that no longer opened on the first try. And Marcus paused with the metal pressed halfway in, his fingers tightening slightly before easing again, a quiet negotiation between what was and what is, and then he pulled it back out, turning it once more in the fading light as if checking whether time had altered something as simple as a key, but it had not. It was the house that had changed, or the life inside it. From within, a soft movement crossed the floor, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate, and then the sound of a second lock disengaging came through the door, clean and unfamiliar, followed by the handle turning from the inside. When the door opened, it did not swing wide, only enough to frame the figure standing behind it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because recognition is not always immediate when it is carried through years of absence. But it was there, in the stillness, in the way Gloria's eyes rested on his face without widening, without softening, simply taking him in as if she had been expecting someone else and had decided not to be surprised. Marcus did not step forward, did not offer an explanation, his hand dropping slowly from the doorframe to his side, the duffel bag brushing lightly against his leg. And the distance between them remained exactly what it was, not measured in feet, but in everything that had not been said for 11 years. "You should not be here," Gloria said finally, her voice even, not raised, not harsh, just placed carefully between them like something fragile that could not afford to be misunderstood. And Marcus let the words settle, did not interrupt them, did not defend himself, because he had learned, somewhere along the road that brought him back, that some sentences are not meant to be answered right away. His eyes moved past her shoulder. Just briefly. Just enough to catch the edge of the living room. The familiar outline of the couch, the lamp near the wall, and then something smaller, something quieter, the corner of a folded blanket he recognized without needing to see the rest of it. And his breath shifted, not louder, just deeper, like the body adjusting to a weight it remembers carrying. "The locks are new," he said after a moment. Not as a question, not as an accusation, just an observation, and Gloria followed his gaze. For half a second before returning it to him. "They needed to be," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that closed the space further instead of opening it. Something that suggested the house had not been waiting the way he thought it had. Marcus nodded once, a small movement, almost respectful, and stepped back half a step, not leaving, just acknowledging that whatever this threshold was, it was no longer his to cross without permission, and for a brief second, the air between them shifted again, softer this time, like something unspoken had been recognized on both sides, and Gloria's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door, not to close it, not yet, but as if deciding how much of the past she was willing to let stand in front of her, because behind her, inside the house, everything remained exactly where it had been left, and in front of her, Marcus stood exactly where he had once chosen not to stay. Gloria did not move aside, but she did not close the door either, and that hesitation, small and almost invisible, was enough for Marcus to notice that whatever boundary stood between them was not made of anger alone. It was made of something older, something that had been carried quietly for years without ever being put down. The air inside the house felt different from the outside, warmer, settled, like it had chosen to belong to itself rather than to the people who once moved through it. And Marcus kept his eyes steady, not forcing his way in, not asking again, because there are moments when a man understands that presence speaks louder than insistence. "I am not staying," he said after a while, his voice low, measured, as if he was placing each word carefully so it would not disturb anything fragile between them. And Gloria's expression did not change, but her grip on the door loosened just enough for the wood to shift another inch open, a quiet invitation that was not spoken out loud. Marcus stepped forward then, slowly, not crossing into the house all at once, but entering it the way someone steps into a memory they are not sure they deserve, his shoes brushing lightly against the floor, carrying in the faint dust of the road he had traveled. And the first thing he noticed was not what had changed, but what had not. The lamp still standing at the same angle near the wall, the edge of the couch still worn in the same place, and the silence, still holding the same weight it always had, as if the house had decided to keep everything exactly where it last felt complete. Gloria stepped back without turning her back on him, her movements careful, controlled, like she was guiding a situation rather than reacting to it. And Marcus set his duffel bag down near the door, not bringing it further. Inside, a quiet signal that he meant what he said, that he was not here to reclaim anything, only to face something he had left unfinished. His gaze moved again, slower this time, taking in the details he had tried not to expect, the folded blanket on the arm of the couch, the small ceramic dish on the table near the hallway. And then he saw it, placed gently near the window where the light fell the softest. A mug, simple, white, with a faint crack near the handle, and something inside him. Shifted, not sharply, not painfully, but deeply, like a memory rising without permission. He walked toward it without thinking, each step quieter than the last, until he stood close enough to see that the crack had been carefully sealed. Not replaced, not discarded, just held together, and his fingers hovered near it without touching, as if even that small contact might disturb whatever had been preserved there. "You kept it," he said, more to himself than to her, and Gloria watched him from a distance, her eyes steady, not following his movement, but understanding it. "Some things are not meant to be replaced," she answered, and there was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet certainty that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if every object carried a piece of a story neither of them had fully told. Marcus nodded once, his hand lowering slowly back to his side, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again, because the house did not need words to explain itself. It had already said everything in the way it had refused to move on, and standing there, between what had been left behind and what had quietly endured, Marcus understood that he had not walked back into an empty place. He had walked into something that had been waiting, not for his return, but for his understanding. Marcus remained by the window a moment longer, not touching the mug, not moving it, just letting his presence settle into the space like it was asking permission to exist there again. And behind him, Gloria walked past slowly, her steps steady, not avoiding him but not inviting him either, moving toward the kitchen with the quiet familiarity of someone who had learned every inch of the house not as a guest, but as a keeper. The sound of a cabinet opening, then closing, followed by the soft click of a kettle being set onto the stove, filled the silence with something almost ordinary. And that was what made it heavier, not the tension, but the normalcy that had continued without him. Marcus turned slightly, watching her from where he stood, noticing the way she reached for things without looking, the way her hand paused briefly near the edge of the counter, as if checking that something was still there before moving on. And he realized that she had not just been living in this house. She had been maintaining it, preserving it, holding it in a state that refused to let time take what it usually does. "You drink coffee now," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition of something that had changed, and Gloria did not turn around, did not stop what she was doing. "I always did," she replied, her voice even, but softer than before, as if the act of speaking about something small made the space less guarded. Marcus let that sit for a moment, his eyes drifting again, this time toward the hallway, where the light dimmed slightly, where the air felt different, heavier, like a place that carried more than the rest of the house. And he took a step in that direction before stopping himself, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for something he did not yet understand. "Her room," he said, the words barely above a breath. And this time Gloria did pause, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, her shoulders still, not tense, just held. "It is not a room," she said after a second, and now she turned, slowly, meeting his eyes again. "It is where she stayed." And there was a difference in the way she said it, a shift that Marcus felt, more than he heard, because it was not about space, it was about time, about presence, about something that had not been allowed to disappear. Marcus nodded once, his throat tightening just slightly, not enough to show, but enough for him to feel it, and he stepped back from the hallway, choosing not to go further, not yet, because whatever waited there was not something he could walk into unprepared. The kettle began to hum softly, the sound building in the background, steady, patient, and Gloria turned back to it, reaching out to lower the heat before it could whistle, as if even that sound would be too loud for what this house held. She poured the water into a mug, not the one by the window, but another, plain, untouched by cracks or memory, and set it on the table without looking at him. "You can sit," she said, not offering comfort, just acknowledging that standing would not change what had already begun. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, then walked over, pulling the chair back slowly, the legs brushing against the floor with a soft, familiar sound, and he sat down, not leaning back, not relaxing, just placing himself there, present, grounded, as if this was the first step in something he had avoided for 11 years. Gloria remained standing for a moment longer before taking the seat across from him, the same position she had held before he arrived, facing the empty chair near the window, and for a brief second, Marcus followed her gaze, seeing the space the way she had been seeing it, not empty, but occupied by something that did not need to be seen to be felt, and in that shared silence, without explanation, without accusation, something shifted again, not resolved, not forgiven, but recognized, as if both of them understood that whatever had been left behind in this house had not been waiting to be found, it had been waiting to be faced. The chair across from Marcus remained empty, but it no longer felt unnoticed, not after the way Gloria had been looking at it, not after the way the room seemed to organize itself around that space, as if it still belonged to someone who had simply stepped away for a moment. Marcus wrapped his hands loosely around the warm mug in front of him, not lifting it, just letting the heat settle into his palms, grounding him in something present, something real, because everything else in the room carried a weight that came from the past, and he needed something that existed now. Gloria sat still, her posture straight but not rigid, her eyes no longer fixed on the chair, but not entirely on him either, as if her attention existed somewhere in between, holding both what was and what had been without choosing one over the other. How long? Marcus said finally, his voice low, steady, the question unfinished but understood. And Gloria did not ask him to clarify, did not make him say more than he needed to, since the day after. She answered, and the simplicity of it made the air shift again, because there was no hesitation, no searching for the right words, just a fact that had been lived with long enough to no longer feel like an explanation. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the surface of the table, tracing the faint lines in the wood, the small imperfections that had always been there but that he had never noticed before, and he let the answer settle into him, not resisting it, not pushing it away, just allowing it to exist alongside everything else he was beginning to understand. You stayed, he said, more to himself than to her, and Gloria's response came just as quietly. Someone had to. And there was no accusation in it, no attempt to place blame. Only a statement that carried the weight of a decision made without expectation of acknowledgment. Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in relief, but in recognition, and he leaned back in his chair for the first time since sitting down, the wood creaking softly under the shift, a sound that felt almost too loud in the stillness of the room. His eyes moved again, this time more deliberately, taking in the details he had been avoiding. The small framed photograph near the edge of the shelf, turned just enough that he could not see the full image from where he sat. The folded sweater draped over the back of a chair that no one had moved, and the way the light from the window fell across the floor, stopping just short of the hallway, as if even it respected the boundary of that space. Did she know? He asked, the words careful, measured, not rushed, because some questions carry consequences simply by being spoken. And Gloria did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting downward for the first time since he had arrived, resting on her hands as they lay still in her lap. The silence stretched, not empty, but full, like a pause that holds more meaning than the words that follow it. And when she finally looked back up, her expression had not changed, but something in her eyes had softened, not toward him, but toward the memory they were both standing inside. She waited, Gloria said, and that was all. No elaboration, no explanation, just two words that settled into the space between them with a weight that neither of them tried to move. And Marcus did not respond, did not ask anything else, because in those two words, he understood more than he had been prepared to hear, more than he had allowed himself to consider, and his grip on the mug tightened just slightly before easing again, the warmth still there, unchanged, even as everything else around him began to shift into something he could no longer ignore. Marcus felt the weight of the room shift subtly as Gloria poured the coffee and set it on the table, the steam rising in thin wisps that seemed to mark the passage of time more than anything else. And he observed it quietly, the warmth reaching his hands, reaching his chest in a way that reminded him of mornings long past, not rushed, not interrupted, just existing. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall measured each second with deliberate patience, each tick echoing softly across the wooden floors, through the empty spaces between the furniture, carrying the silence like a companion. And Marcus realized that silence itself was speaking in ways no one needed to translate, telling him about the decisions made, the choices held, the lives maintained without him. He glanced toward the hallway again, the light dimming as clouds moved across the window, casting slow shadows that shifted over the familiar patterns of the floor, and he could see the lines of time etched subtly into the walls, faded wallpaper. A picture framed slightly askew, signs of life preserved but not unchanging. And it struck him that the house had kept its own memory, its own narrative, not waiting for him but continuing, acknowledging his return only as one more element in its ongoing story. Gloria remained seated, her posture unaltered, her hands resting lightly on her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a calmness that suggested neither instruction nor expectation. She left things for us, she said, and Marcus absorbed the words, not asking, not clarifying, simply letting them hang in the air, understanding that what was left behind had not been abandoned, but intentionally preserved, a gesture toward continuity, toward remembrance. He nodded once, small, deliberate, as if agreeing silently with the house itself, with the order it had maintained, with the care it had held in each object, Each corner, each quiet moment. The sunlight fell further, stretching across the floor until it touched the mug again. The steam curling, ephemeral, marking the passage of a moment that could not be reclaimed. And Marcus allowed himself to breathe in slowly, to let the warmth seep deeper, not just into his hands, but into the weight he had been carrying for over a decade, feeling at ease, not vanish, but settle into a new form, manageable, present. Gloria observed him, eyes steady, not judging, not prompting, merely existing as another presence in the room that recognized the quiet change occurring. And Marcus felt that recognition like a gentle acknowledgment, a small permission granted to belong here again, in this space, without disruption, without demand, just being. He took a careful sip of the coffee at last, the liquid warm, steady, grounding, and in that simple act, something inside him softened, a thread connecting him to what had been, to what had endured, to what he had returned to, and the room seemed to lean in, not crowded, not pressured, just filled with the quiet understanding of two lives intersecting again, held by the objects, the light, the silence, and the careful, unspoken care of the woman sitting across from him. And for the first time since he arrived, Marcus allowed the thought to enter fully, that some things are not fixed by force, not healed by words, not mended by action alone, but simply by presence, by the patient endurance of being. And in this presence, he began to feel, quietly, that the past had not left him behind entirely. It had only waited. Marcus set his mug down gently on the table, the faint ring it left on the wood a quiet mark of his presence. And he lifted his eyes to meet Gloria's once more, seeing the subtle shift in her expression that suggested both recognition and restraint, an understanding that some truths are not spoken loudly, but felt in the spaces between words. He leaned slightly forward, not crossing the table too quickly, not forcing any movement, because patience had become the measure of his steps, and in this house, after 11 years, that patience was necessary to navigate the layers of memory that still lingered in the air. Gloria watched him carefully, her hands resting lightly on her knees, the afternoon sun streaming through the window and casting soft lines across her face. And Marcus noticed the way the light caught the edges of her hair, the subtle contours that had been familiar yet distant in his mind. And he let himself take it in without comment, letting the observation exist as its own. Acknowledgment of time passed. There are letters, Gloria said, finally breaking the quiet, her voice steady, carrying a weight that did not demand response but invited awareness. And Marcus inclined his head, his attention focused on her, listening without speaking, understanding that this statement was not about the letters themselves, but about the continuity. They represented the care that had been maintained in their creation and preservation over the years. She stood then, moving slowly toward a small side table where a neat stack of envelopes rested, yellowed slightly at the edges, and she picked one up with deliberate care, sliding it across the table to him without a word, the action itself speaking volumes more than any explanation could. Marcus reached out, hesitating just a moment before touching the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his fingers, noticing the faint scent of ink and age, a reminder of what had been written long ago and preserved intentionally. And he allowed himself to breathe in that faint familiarity, letting the sense of connection settle gently over him. He opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the paper as if it were fragile, and the handwriting inside was precise, familiar, yet distant, carrying memories of moments he had not been present for. And he read slowly, each word resonating, echoing the actions of the house, the presence of Gloria, and the passage of time in a way that required no further explanation. Gloria remained seated across from him, her eyes soft, observing without intrusion, allowing him the space to encounter what had been left for him. And in that quiet observation, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle, not resolution, not closure, but recognition, the acknowledgment of what had endured in his absence. The sunlight continued to shift, moving across the floor and illuminating different objects in the room, the coffee mug, the small lamp, the edge of a folded blanket, and with each change, the room seemed to breathe alongside him, the rhythm slow, deliberate, steady, and Marcus realized that the house, the letters, the preserved objects, and the presence of Gloria were guiding him gently toward understanding, toward the realization that reconciliation, like time itself, does not demand force. It requires presence, attention, and the quiet willingness to witness and be witnessed. And in this layered stillness, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the weight of the past, not as a burden, but as a part of the continuum that had waited for him to return, patient, unjudging, and quietly enduring. Marcus set the letters aside gently, the soft shuffle of paper echoing slightly in the quiet room, and he let his gaze move toward Gloria, noticing the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her posture held a balance between patience and expectation, a stance he recognized from years before yet had never truly appreciated until now. He reached for his mug again, the warmth steady in his hands, and for a long moment, they both sat without speaking, the silence carrying more meaning than words ever could, filled with unspoken acknowledgment of absence, endurance, and the careful preservation of memory. The sunlight shifted slowly across the floor, catching the dust in the air and highlighting small imperfections in the furniture that had been unchanged, deliberate, a record of care, and Marcus felt a quiet respect for the way everything had been maintained, for the intention behind each placement and action, for the thoughtfulness that spoke louder than any explanation. Gloria finally broke the pause, standing to retrieve another envelope from the side table, the movement fluid, calm, and she placed it in front of him without a word, the gesture simple, deliberate, full of meaning, and Marcus opened it carefully, feeling the weight of the paper in his hands, the scent faintly carrying the past into the present, and he read each line slowly, allowing the words to settle in, to resonate, understanding that they contained not just messages, but a deliberate act of remembrance and care, a bridge across years that had otherwise been unspoken. The room remained still, save for the quiet ticking of the clock, the hum of the kettle that had long since been turned off, the soft brushing of Marcus's hand against the table as he turned the envelope slightly to catch the light, noticing subtle details, the way the ink had faded but the intent remained, the deliberate choice of words preserved with care. Gloria remained seated, observing quietly, not prompting, not guiding, simply allowing the space to hold both of them and the past together. And Marcus felt that presence deeply, understanding that some reconciliations do not require conversation, that some acknowledgments are made simply by sitting together in shared recognition of what has endured. He folded the letter back into the envelope carefully, placing it aside, and for the first time he allowed himself to notice the small things. The worn edge of the rug, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air, the way the sunlight touched the table just so, each detail a subtle testament to the passage of time, the patience of maintenance, and the endurance of care. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the breath travel fully into his body, allowing the tension he had carried for 11 years to ease slightly. And in that moment, the room felt less like a memory preserved without him and more like a space that had been waiting for his understanding, his acknowledgment, his quiet presence. Gloria's eyes met his briefly, unguarded, acknowledging without comment that the space, the letters, the preserved objects, and their shared history had created a foundation, fragile yet steady, upon which they could begin to exist together in the present without erasing the past. Marcus lifted his mug once more, bringing the warmth to his lips, and in that simple act he felt the weight of time, absence, and care merge into a quiet understanding, a patient recognition that some things endure not by words, not by action alone, but by being present, attentive, and willing to witness. And as the sunlight continued to shift slowly across the room, he realized that he had finally arrived in the moment he had been returning to for 11 years, and that arrival itself carried a measure of peace that neither needed to be spoken nor forced. Marcus placed the empty mug back onto the table with care, the soft clink against the wood marking a quiet conclusion to the ritual they had both followed, and he lifted his gaze to the window, noticing how the sunlight now lingered on the floor in warmer tones, stretching across the room, as if to emphasize the slow passage of the afternoon into evening, and he allowed himself a deep breath, steady and deliberate, feeling the tension of 11 years dissolve gradually into something gentler, something that did not require explanation or apology. Gloria remained seated across from him, her hands resting lightly in her lap, the slight rise and fall of her shoulders betraying only a subtle shift of relief, an acknowledgment that the quiet endurance of the house, the letters, and their shared presence had brought them to a point of understanding that could not have been forced, and Marcus felt that weight, absorbing it quietly, letting it settle around him like a protective layer that had always been waiting to form. He stood slowly, walking toward the window, not out of urgency, not to escape, but to trace the patterns of light on the floor, to notice the faint scuffs and marks left by years of living, each one a reminder that time moves regardless of absence, that care persists even when unnoticed, and that reconciliation does not always arrive in grand gestures, but in the patient acknowledgment of what endures. Gloria watched him, not speaking, her presence a steady, grounding force that allowed him the space to inhabit both his memories and the reality of the house now, and Marcus realized that he could sense her understanding without words, that the room itself had become a quiet witness to his return, preserving not just objects, but intention, not just memory, but the continuity of life that had never ceased despite the years apart. He returned to the table, leaning lightly on the edge, and his eyes fell on the empty chair by the window, the one that had held so much absence and so many unspoken moments. And for the first time, it did not feel empty but inhabited by the acknowledgment of presence, by the quiet patience of the house and the careful consideration of the woman across from him. Marcus's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, subtle, restrained, but genuine, and he allowed himself to feel the significance of returning, not to reclaim what was lost, not to correct the past, but simply to exist in a space that had continued, patiently, faithfully, without need for justification. Gloria rose then, moving to place the kettle back on the stove, her movements fluid and calm, and Marcus observed the way she handled each object with deliberate care, not needing his attention, not seeking his approval, simply maintaining the rhythm of life that had carried them to this moment. He took a final glance around the room, noting the interplay of light, the quiet resonance of the house, the preserved objects, and the spaces in between them. And he understood that presence alone could heal the invisible gaps left by absence, that acknowledgment, without words, could offer a measure of closure, and that endurance, patience, and careful attention had created a foundation for both of them to inhabit the present without erasing the past. With a gentle exhale, Marcus stepped back, allowing the moment to settle, feeling a deep sense of calm and understanding, the room, the sunlight, Gloria, and the memories merging into a quiet resolution that needed no voice, no gesture, only the simple, profound acknowledgement of being there, fully, patiently, and faithfully.